Hello, Psych 101 students. Welcome to Module 5, Chapter 7, Learning Objective 5, Retrieval Cues and Forgetting. Okay, so this figure here summarizes the three categories of processes that affect the ability to access stored memories. Uh, there are retrieval cues, which is anything that helps the person access a memory in long-term storage, including context-dependent memory, state-dependent memory, and mnemonics. We'll talk about all of these in this learning objective. And then forgetting affects our ability to access memories. The inability to retrieve a memory from long-term storage. It includes interference, blocking, and absent-mindedness. We will also talk about forgetting in this learning objective. And then in learning objective 6, we would talk about distortion, which shows how memory is flawed in many ways, including memory bias, flashbulb memories, misattribution, suggestibility, and false memories. So let's begin by looking at retrieval cues. Many types of forgetting are actually failures of retrieval. It's not that the memories, aren't there. They may be there, but you just can't retrieve them. Using retrieval cues can help you to access your information in long-term memory. So a retrieval cue is anything that helps a person access information in long-term storage. In general, we're more likely to remember something when the conditions present at the time we encoded it are also present at the time of retrieval. That is, like, the more match there is between the conditions when you learn something and then the conditions when you try to remember it, if there's a overlap of conditions, whether it's the context you're in or the state that you're in, if there's more of a match, you're more likely to be able to recall or retrieve information. There are two ways this effect works: context-dependent memory and state-dependent memory. I'm going to start with state-dependent memory. This refers to the superior retrieval of memories when an organism, and I say organism because it applies to humans, animals as well as humans. So it's a superior retrieval of memories when an organism is in the same physiological or psychological state as it was during encoding. So, for example, let's say we're in a certain state where we learn something when we're drunk or when we're high, for instance. We would recall it better when we're drunk or when we're high again. People have the experience of learning something in a certain state like that, and then they forget it the next day, but it comes back to them when they go back into that state because there's a match. Mood dependent learning is one type of state dependent memory. So if your mood matches, your mood now matches your mood when you first learned something, you're more likely to retrieve it. So, for instance, when you're depressed, what kind of memories come to you? Memories when you were sad or depressed before, which is one of the problems with depression. You tend to be be thinking of a lot of negative things because it matches the state that you're in now. And if you're really happy and you're in a great euphoric state, then you tend to remember really good memories from when you were happy before or euphoric before. So it's no it's no accident that depression is like a spiral, that because you tend to recall things that match your current mood. So you recall negative instances from the past. When you're in a really good mood and things are going well in life, and you tend to think of and recall memories that match your current state, and so you tend to think of good things. Okay. Uh, let's go on to context dependent memory. So that was, about your internal state. Context dependent memory refers to the superior recall when the external context, the environment, around you of the original memories matches the retrieval context. So, like, you're in the same kind of physical location or the same kind of location as when you learn something. And so there's a cue in the environment that triggers the memory. Um, one, one example of this is, I don't know if you've ever had the experience where you're trying to remember something and it's not coming to you, and you might just be walking, like all of a sudden you walk into a room, let's say in your house or something, and the memory pops into your head. It may be because the memory, occurred in that room, and so when you enter the room, it brings back the same context, and all of a sudden you remember it again. So, like, if there's something that you're ever forgetting, if you can, like, go back to the same location where you learned it, it's more likely to trigger the memory. This is why, for instance, that you should take your tests in the same place where you learn the material. So you shouldn't, like, study in one room and take the test in a different room. You do better if you take the tests in this class in the same location where you study the material, because everything in the environment can act as a cue. You kind of remember, like, looking at certain things in the room as you learned about something, and then when you take the test, those act as reminders or retrieval cues. Let's look at an example of a study that looked at context dependent memory. It's a pretty unique study. What they did was they had people learn a list of 40 unrelated words, either on land or underwater. And then they were tested either on land or underwater. And if you look at this graph, let's look at just the first two bars. These are all subjects that studied this list of 40 unrelated words, while they were on land. And then if they were tested on land, you can see that they got, between 13 to 14 correct. But if they were tested underwater, they only got about 8 or 9 correct. There was the other half of the subjects, they studied the list of words while they were underwater. And then the blue bars, if they were tested while underwater, they scored about, it looks like about 11 or 12 correct. But if they were then tested on land, this green bar on the right, they only got about, it looks like about 8 or 9 correct. So in each case, when there was a match of where you learned the material and where you were then tested for it, people performed better. And this is how context dependent memory works. You're just more likely to recall something when you're in the same physical location. And once again, or the state dependent memory is if you're in the same state, internal state, you're more likely to recall something if it matches when the state you were in when you learned it. Okay. Prospective memory means remembering to do something at some future time. I gotta remember to stop on my way home after work to pick up some drugs from the drugstore, or something like that. This takes up valuable cognitive resources. It's hard to keep something in mind because you're going about your day and you're concentrating on what's happening at the moment. It's often difficult to remember to do something later. But retrieval cues can certainly help your prospective memory. Um, it can be something even really simple. Like, sometimes when I think, oh, I've got to remember to do this later, I might do something like take my ring off my ring finger, and I put it on my thumb actually, and then like and which is it's pretty comfortable and it stays there, but and then later it's like, oh yeah, my ring's on my thumb, and it reminds me that oh I wanted to do something. Or some people might take like a elastic band and put it around their wrist as a reminder, that they have to remember to do something later. The only problem with that, of course, is that it doesn't tell you, putting the ring on a different finger or the elastic band around the wrist. It doesn't tell you what to remember. So obviously, if you can use sticky notes or put a note in your smartphone, these are a little bit superior retrieval cues because they can tell you exactly what you needed to remember to do. But it is good to have to use something to remind you if there's something important you have to remember to do. And that ring on my thumb or the elastic band around the wrist or it acts as a retrieval cue. I see it, then I remember, oh yeah, I remember the situation. I moved that ring to my thumb because of these important drugs I have to pick up at the drugstore. All right. Mnemonics are also a type of retrieval cue. Sorry, they're learning aids or strategies that help that use retrieval cues to improve access to memory. I'll just give you some quick examples of mnemonics. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. You may have heard that before. You take the first letter from each word, and you get PEMDAS, PEMDAS. It tells you the order of operations in math, parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. You've got the every good boy does fine, or every good boy deserves fudge is the way it used to be. And you take the first letter of each word, and it's the names of the lines in the treble clef, E, G, B, D, F. You've got memory aids like I before E, except after C. I use that all the time. 30 days past September, April, June, and November. All the rest have 31, except for February. I don't know. I think the rhyme continues, but that's that's enough to remember. And I tell you, I still use that all the time. I'll be thinking about, are there 30 or 31 days in this month? And I just do the little rhyme in my head, and it reminds me that 30 days are in September, April, June, and November. Okay. I remember, and I gave you one in an earlier module. I talked about the sympathetic nervous system. I told you that's the nervous system when you're under stress. I pointed out that sympathetic starts with S, stress starts with S, and I actually still use that one. Parasympathetic has an R in it. It stands for rest and relaxation and restoring resources. Anything like that, any kind of memory aid like that is a mnemonic. The more you can connect your current knowledge to some new material, the better. So you're using memory aids to remember something new that you've learned, and if you can just connect that to something you already know, it makes it so much easier. One method that some people use, and it's not really taught or it's not well used these days, but the method of loci. It's a mnemonic of associating items you want to remember with a physical location you already know. Memory champions often use this method. They use familiar places like their home when they have to remember things in a sequence or order. So they picture walking into the front door and walking through all their rooms and up their stairs and through the upstairs rooms, and you can place items along the route And then you can remember the sequence of items. We saw this method in the two videos that I presented from Joshua Foer. He talks about this method of loci. Okay, forgetting. So forgetting is the inability to access a memory in long-term storage. A guy named Hermann Ebbinghaus, he conducted forgetting experiments in the late 1800s, and he used himself as the only subject. I mean, when I look at the work that Ebbinghaus did, I mean, he spent so long testing himself. I mean, he did years of testing on himself, um, and was very successful in learning a lot about forgetting. What he did was he examined. This was one of his studies. He examined how long it took him to relearn lists of familiar nonsense syllables. Nonsense syllables are like just short made up words like VUT or BIK or KUH. So like he wanted to start with stuff that he wasn't already familiar with. So he made up these nonsense syllables that didn't make actual words. And he would learn them, and he used and then test himself at different times. And he used this testing of himself with nonsense syllables to develop the forgetting curve. Here we see this curve over on the right. This is one of many graphs that he produced. In this particular one, he would learn, a long list of these nonsense syllables to different extents during one day. So like he would learn it, like he would repeat it like 8 times if you look along the bottom of the graph there, and or 16 or 24 or up to 64 times he would relearn the list in one day. And then he would test himself the next day and see how long it took him to relearn the list. So like, if he had only studied it 8 times on the first day, it would take him like 20 minutes, as you can see on the graph. But if he studied it like 64 times, it would only take him about, it looks like about 7 minutes or so. So, lower on this graph means less forgetting. If you can relearn the list faster on the second day, that means that you've remembered more of it. And so this was one way of graphing forgetting. Like it was the amount of time that you save, based on how well you know something. And this was just one of many experiments that he conducted using himself as his only subject. In another experiment, he would learn a list of nonsense syllables, and then he would like learn it until he knew it perfectly. So he would learn it like however long it took during it one day until he could like repeat it perfectly right. And then he would test his memory of that list after various time intervals, anywhere from 20 minutes later up to 30 days later, without any further rehearsal. So, he wouldn't look at it again. And so, like, sometimes he would have a condition where he tests himself only 20 minutes later, but then he would have to restart the whole study. He would learn a new list. He might test himself after one day. He might test himself after, 10 days, after 30 days. So, like, this was grueling research. Like, whenever I think about Ebbinghaus, he was so committed, because this research must have taken so much of his time. Anyways, what he found was that, and by the way, this is late 1800s, only one subject himself, and he came up with very accurate forgetting curves. He found that there's typically a very rapid loss of recall in the first hour. So after you learn a bunch of new stuff, you lose a lot of it within 1 hour. followed by a slightly lower loss, so that he found that about 60% of what you learned is forgotten after 9 hours. And after 24 hours, after one day, about 2/3 of anything that you memorized is forgotten. And but then it the curve, we don't have a picture of this curve here, but it like it I can't describe it. It's like a U-shaped curve. Maybe once you get to a certain point though, after about 24 hours, you've forgotten about 2/3. What you still remember after 24 hours, you tend to remember for a long time. There's not a lot of forgetting that goes on after that first day. Um, okay. Um, okay. Finally, people with HSAM, remember that's highly superior autobiographical memory. Those people that can remember like every day of their lives. They've reported that they find it difficult not to think about bad days and tragic events, which might contribute to feelings of anxiety or depression. I mentioned this earlier that it's kind of like a blessing and a curse. It's kind of seems like it's cool to remember everything, but some stuff we are, we, a regular person, we have processes in our brain that sometimes help us forget things that we don't want to remember, things that might cause us anxiety or depression. Uh, we have brain mechanisms that help us repress those things and to forget them so that they don't keep bothering us. But those people can never forget. Okay, let's go on. So interference is the loss of information due to competition with new incoming information. The more similar the two pieces of information, some old piece that you already knew and then some new piece that you learned, the more interference happens. Interference happens in two directions. In the first direction, we call it retroactive interference. This is when access to older memories is impaired by newer memories. So retro means like going backwards in time. So something newer interferes with something older. And you can see the example in the top picture. Um, Older memories are hard to access due to interference from newer information. So you study psychology because you have a test coming up. And then after you finish studying psychology, you study biology because maybe you have a test in biology coming up as well. When you take your psychology test, the the fact that you studied biology in between can interfere with the psychology learning you did. So the new information can interfere with the older information. That's retroactive interference. It can also happen the other direction, proactive interference, when access to newer memories is impaired by older memories. So you study political science, and then you study history, you take a history test, but the political science that you originally learned is interfering with your history studying. Let me give you some examples, that maybe makes some more sense. If you think about retroactive interference, for anyone that has changed addresses or phone numbers during your life, remember at one time you knew your old address or your old phone number really well, but if some time's gone by, like most likely you have trouble remembering some address that you knew for years or some phone number that you had for years because now it's been replaced by your new address or your new phone number. That's retroactive interference. I can't remember any of my old phone numbers I ever had. I can't remember any of my old addresses. Actually, I remember the last one because it wasn't that long ago, but I can't remember the address of the house I grew up on for 15 years. Okay. Proactive interference examples. Um, Sometimes you have to create a new password. You get prompted, you got to create a new password. And then, you go to enter it a day or two later, and what happens, you just remember the old password. So the old information is interfering with the new. It's like, oh, the older, the old password keeps coming to your mind, but it's like, oh yeah, I changed it to something. What's the new one? And sometimes it's like that old information is still too strong, and so it's interfering with the newer information that you'd learned. So having a new password, or when you get a new phone number for a little while, you might keep thinking of your old phone number. I'll give you a real example that happened to me. So I lived a lot of, most of my life in Canada. We have something called a social insurance number. It's just like your social security number in the US, which, obviously I have a social security number now. And I've been in the US for a lot of years now. Uh, I don't know, whatever, 20 years or something. But not too long ago, a few years ago, I went to the bank. I was creating a new account at a new bank and filling out the paperwork, and I just wasn't really thinking deeply. And there was a spot for my social security number, and I wrote down my social insurance number from Canada, even though I've been here for so many years. And I know, I know my social security number off the top of my head, but I wrote down the wrong number, and it is, a very different number, and it actually turned out to be a serious kind of problem, and because you can't use false social security numbers, and so I had to actually prove to the bank that how I made the mistake, that this was the number I had in Canada, and it just popped into my mind that day, and so that was old information interfering with my memory for newer information. That was proactive interference. Okay, let's go on. It's a little one of these little learning tips. Retro means old. We've seen retro used a couple of times. Retrograde amnesia we talked about. That's when you after a brain injury you have trouble remembering things from the past. So retro means old, like in the past. So retrograde amnesia is when you forget things from the past before the brain injury. Just like retroactive interference is when new information interferes with older information. So whenever you see retro, it's something from the past. It's affecting something in the past. So retrograde amnesia affects your memory in the past. Retroactive interference also affects your memory from the past. Okay, let's go on. The tip of the tongue phenomena is an example of what we call blocking. It's a retrieval failure where we are sure we know the information, but we just can't come up with it. Whenever, if you have the tip of the tongue, it's like you know it, and it's just for some reason that information's blocked. It's like that you'll remember it later or the next day. It's something that you're familiar with, but it's just not coming now. And that's an example of what we call blocking when you get like tip of the tongue phenomenon. Blocking often occurs because of interference from words that are similar in some way, such as in sound or meaning, and that are repeatedly experienced. A lot of times, something else is coming to your mind, some other word, and it keeps blocking your retrieval of what you actually look for. It's like it sounds like this, or it's like this word, but it's different. This happened to me with my ex-wife. Um, she changed her name. This is a number of years ago, and she changed her name. And I knew, she's my ex-wife is the one I had my daughter with. So my daughter's 17, so I've known her longer than that. So I had a lot of years of experience with her original name, and she changed her name, and there was so many times that I experienced blocking because I would forget her newer name because the old name would just pop into my head all because it was so familiar. And she was very understanding. She said, should give people that knew her longer, she would give a break to, because she understood that, like, if you spent years and years and years calling somebody one name, it's hard to all of a sudden switch. And although now I have no problem, it's been enough years, but I had a lot of that blocking going on where I had trouble recalling her newer name because the old one kept entering into my mind. And finally, Absent-mindedness is the inattentive or shallow encoding of events. The major cause of absent-mindedness is failing to pay attention. This is why we misplace things like your keys or your phone. My wife misplaces her glasses all the time, and then she has trouble finding them because she can't see. But it happens, because your mind is on something else when you place the item down somewhere. It's just that you're not paying attention at the time you put your keys down or you put your phone down. You're thinking about other things and you just put it down, and this is why you don't encode, properly that event. And so this is why you can't remember where it is. This absent-mindedness happened to Yo-Yo Ma, shown in this picture here. And he's showing off his $2.5 million 18th century cello, and it's worth $2.5 million. And he happened to leave it in a cab one day. It was returned to him, thank goodness. But he just absentmindedly, I'm sure his mind was on something else, and he walked out of the cab, leaving his cello. Um, Anyways, that is the conclusion of learning objective 5.